Bernard Baruch once pointed out that while many saw the apple fall, it took Newton to ask why. Today, I will attempt to play the role of Newton in this room of scientists, business experts, and innovators. You may ask, how can the FDA play a role in facilitating innovation? Aren't we just a bunch of regulators? I'll attempt to answer that question by going through several steps. The way I'll start is with consideration of some of the great innovations in the history of medicine and technology. If we look back to the past, perhaps one of the greatest innovations was the development of the Gutenberg printing press. This is an interesting example because the story goes that Gutenberg was stuck trying to figure out how to get his printing press to work, how he could bring the printed word to the masses. The story goes that he spent a weekend at a local vineyard where he saw a device that was being used to press grapes. The light bulb went on, the inspiration was present, and he went back to his facility, to his lab, and realized that that was the missing piece, bridging from the wine industry to the printing business, and so became the beginning of that revolution. There are other examples. Many people look at the eradication of smallpox and the development of the vaccine against smallpox as an example of a triumph of science and technology. In fact, that's an example of the serendipity of innovation. Back in the 1700s, farmers in the rural areas of England started to notice that the farmers that had cows infected with cowpox were less susceptible to the perils and the dangers of smallpox, and began the process of using the infected pustules from cows to auto-inoculate to protect themselves from smallpox. And so began the story of developing the vaccine that led to its eradication only 40 or 50 years ago. There are more recent examples, and if we look at technology, we can find some very interesting ones. The internet, which we're all used to using in so many different parts of our daily life, is actually an example of unintended consequences. That system was developed by the military through the agency DARPA as a way to create redundant communications between military bases. Even though the people involved were some of the best and brightest, I doubt that even they could have foreseen the social implications, the financial implications, or the technological implications of connecting the entire world as the internet does today. In the medical arena, many people look at CT scans or ultrasounds or MRIs as ways to have tests done for a doctor to use routinely. There's not much thought about it. Well, when I look back only 20, 25 years to when I was in training as a medical student, CT scans and MRIs and ultrasounds were available, but considered a limited resource. With their full role not quite identified, I remember on my surgical rotation as a medical student working as hard as possible to avoid participation in a very, very difficult case called exploratory laparotomy. And as hard as it was for me as a medical student, think of what was happening to those patients. Coming in with an unknown disease or disorder, the doctors would look them in the eye and say, I don't know what the cause is, but what I'm going to do is open you up, take a look, and figure it out. Imagine that. Undergoing an operation with an incision across the entire length of the abdomen to look around to make a diagnosis. Huge amount of suffering, morbidity, and risk to that procedure is almost eliminated because now a doctor can say, I don't know what's happening. Let me take some really precise pictures of your insides while you relax on a table in a cool air-conditioned room. It's transformed the practice of medicine, and the reason that happened was because there was an intersection of the development of the mini computer, very, very powerful computers in the 1970s, with an age-old technique of taking sliced x-rays of the body called tomograms. By combining those two, by finding the intersection from what seemed like pretty important tools in and of themselves, yielded a product and yielded a process that enabled the transformation of the delivery of healthcare. And so we think about these kinds of examples, and there are many, many that can be added to the list showing how technology evolved, technology was discovered. But it's important to remember that some of the most transformative innovations, the most important discoveries and their applications, are relatively simple. One example of an innovation that had profound impact was that of the work of Ignaz Semmelweis in Austria, when he realized the importance of hand washing to reduce the risk of surgical infections. The story goes that at one of the great hospitals, there was a rotation between A days and B days. The A days, the attending physicians took care of women delivering children, and on the B days, the medical students would assist and be able to learn. It turned out that on B days, the risk of death from going into that hospital for a simple delivery was about 10 times the risk on the A days. And people, of course, were blaming it on the relatively unsophisticated or untrained medical students learning their way. But Semmelweis had a different view. Now remember, this was at a time in the 1600s where bacteria were not discovered, where microbes and viruses were not part of science, were not understood, where there was really no evidence to support them. And yet he had this realization based on his intuition that the medical students who were working in the anatomy lab and going right from the anatomy lab working on cadavers to the delivery suite must have something on their hands, something that couldn't be seen, something that he had to imagine, to use his intuition about, to say that there was a vector that was happening, that carrying that infectious particle. He used chlorine bleach on the medical student's hands and dropped the infection rate on that B day back down to that A day, completely eliminating the risk and demonstrating for the first time through that indirect step, using his intuition and insight, that in fact there were microbes causing the infection that led to death in delivery. So profound impact, yet very simple technology. He took a bleach and applied it to hand washing. Another great example is that of the electric light bulb. Now, most of the times when we talk about the electric light bulb, we think of it as a great technological advance. After all, it's changed everything, from the way we can walk down the street to how things work at home to the way this studio is lit. One of the real interesting things about it is that the development of the electric light, the incandescent bulb by Edison, is one that's fraught with stories of all of the failures. And people who innovate seem to have the attitude that Edison had, which was that it wasn't that he kept on failing, it's that he successfully proved that those 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 things that he tried wouldn't work. Successful proofs on the way to an innovation. Now, why am I talking about it here on the heels of hand washing is pretty simple. Because somehow, by steps that I can't figure out, and I'm not sure that there's a clear line making the connection in this evolution, but somehow surgeons about 100 years ago stopped operating by candlelight and brought that incandescent light bulb into the operating room. I guess it's happenstance, but if you think about it, it's pretty dramatic that putting the light bulb into the operating room and washing hands are probably the two greatest innovations to reduce surgical mortality in the history of modern medicine. So it can be complex, it can be simple, it oftentimes is formed by happenstance or intuition, sometimes by noticing something in one field and then applying it to the other. These are some of the lessons that we see on a daily basis with the products we regulate, whether it's the early submissions or the observations of their performance in the clinical setting. So to understand how to transmit those opportunities to you, what I'd like to do is take a little bit of a shift and look at some of the things that we see on a daily basis in the FDA and certainly in the Center for Devices that represent opportunities for innovation. Specifically, what I'd like to talk about is the link between cancer, computer malware, and innovation. So if we're taking these three things that seem to be so disparate, I need to first come up with an explanation for what I mean. Let's think about how the body and a cancer interact as we think about how a computer and malware interact. Now, just to be clear, When I speak of malware, I'm talking about things like viruses and Trojan horses and the kind of software that we all worry about, both on our home computer as well as the networks that run our important businesses and our important systems. The common thread here is that it starts in two ways. First, we'll look at the systems, okay? And what I want to do is look at the systems both from the point of view of body versus cancer and cancer versus body, as well as the same parallel for computer and malware. So if we think about the systems, one of the things that's common to the human body and computer systems is that it appears as though there's almost limitless potential. That is, what these systems can do is incredible. The fact that people are developing new medical products, that people are communicating, that people are interacting, it's incredible what the body can do on an intellectual level, social level, physical level. And computer systems are similar. If you think back to the first computer developed back in the 1940s, ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania, it was considered an incredible breakthrough, yet was really only able to calculate trajectories for missiles, and wasn't able to achieve that until after World War II ended. Its goal was to help in the performance of the military in World War II. Yet if we look at how these systems have evolved over the millennia for humans, over decades for computers, what we see is that the systems really have almost perfect control, almost perfect protection. Let's think about cancer for a second. Every day in our body, cells are performing activities. They're either undergoing division and replicating to replace themselves. They're carrying on the process of synthesizing proteins. They're performing incredibly complex activities. And amidst all those activities, things can go wrong. A cell can start to take on a program through a mutation in its genes that really is completely different than its intended path, and it may lead, in fact, to that cell becoming the first cancerous cell. The human immune system is looking for those kinds of problems constantly with an incredible surveillance system that's designed to basically find those cells that are performing in a way that is not the ideal, that can go awry and develop cancer. It can isolate those cells. It can destroy those cells. And that's a very similar process that exists in computers. The software controls that we have in place, the antivirus programs that we're all familiar with, also tend to try to isolate those viruses, those pieces of code that could potentially perform tasks different than the computer is intended to, and certainly different than we intend the computer to perform. So again, it isolates. We try to delete it once we recognize it. Both systems are very, very powerfully put together and very effective at performing this task. And in both, the parallel also exists between the body and a computer system in that there are relatively limited resources. We can do almost an unlimited number of things, but there's only so much available, whether it be the computer bandwidth and the processing speed, or the amount of hours that our body can move and do physical activity before we need to rest. And it requires that each system be incredibly well integrated. If they're not integrated, the effectiveness doesn't work. Think about me moving my hands to feed myself. I need to coordinate an incredible number of activities in the hand, in the arm, with the device as it brings back to my mouth to be able to chew and swallow. These are complicated activities that have innumerable control systems, both positive and negative feedback. And in essence, the way these systems work is that they're always on. It's as if you are running a system where the accelerator is pressed down constantly, and so there needs to be a little bit of a brake applied. The brain doesn't come up with a thought very quickly if it has to turn on out of the blue. Think about what it's like when you first wake up from a real deep sleep. It's sometimes a little bit hard to get the cobwebs out. So essentially, when we're awake, our brain is always on, our body is always on, and the computer systems certainly are always on. Now what this means is that within these systems, we could consider how these problems, cancer and malware, work and what they're doing. And to do that and potentially understand them better, what we've done is we've spent an incredible amount of resources, millions, if not billions of dollars studying this to understand the adaptations of these systems going awry. So when we think about adaptations, what we're talking about, remember, is that these are bad actors, whether it be cancer cells, whether it be malware. And what they're figuring out how to do is to escape detection, escape control. They'll mutate, they'll form in the body, cells will change their receptors. In both the case of cancer and the case of malware, the goal essentially of that part of the system going awry is to hijack the resources, to take all the metabolic fuel from neighboring cells, to grow, to occupy space. In a computer, it's attempting to maximize the use of the entire system's resources. What I'm trying to draw as a conclusion here for you in this presentation is that it seems as though this example of a biologic and this example of a technologic system may have more similarities than differences. And that becomes important because what it means is that there's a potential lesson here. The lesson is for us to look for the opportunities everywhere. So I'm going to get back specifically in a few minutes to the lessons we can learn from cancer and malware. What I'd like to do for a few minutes first is talk a bit about our innovation initiative that we recently launched. The innovation initiative is a multi-pronged program where we've put together a proposal that we've shared publicly, and now we're seeking input from various stakeholders across all areas, whether it be industry, academics, or especially the patients and the providers, to better understand how we can affect the process of innovation in the short term and the long term to serve as the key facilitators. One of the things I think I've demonstrated so far is that we have an ability to ask questions, to bring ideas together from one field to another, to bridge, to try to implore people to understand how intuition can be used and how the innovative process has worked in the past and can teach us going forward. So we can talk in more detail as we do in the paper, and we hope to do in an upcoming meeting in March at a public workshop about our innovation pathway to take on some of these exciting projects and help them get to the go, no-go decisions faster and more efficiently. Not affecting the evidence required to get to market, but making sure that we have figured out ways to get to those answers quicker. What I'd like to do is take a little shift back to the example of cancer and malware and talk a little bit about where I think there may be an opportunity. What I want to do is talk about how they serve as examples that may help us unlock the power of the human brain. Now, many of us have seen either TV shows or read articles about savants. Savants are people who appear to have one particular skill that they can perform at a level that's almost unimaginable to the rest of us. And we're starting to understand how the savant brain works. We're starting to understand that the savant brain is one that tells us that oftentimes when there's part of the brain damage, typically what you'll see is the left brain, the more analytic side, that there's a part of the right brain, the creative side, whether it be music or math, that seems to be able to perform things that are almost superhuman. In essence, what's happening potentially in this situation is that the allocation of resources in the brain is different. The control mechanism might not be in place. So the equivalent of the cancer cell, of the virus, which in this case is some incredible creative part of the brain, now can take all the resources. It's always on, and it's now moving forward in a way that represents the potential of that region of the brain. So when we think about it that way, one of the things that we can do is talk about and imagine what it would be like if we could start to understand that, how it could transform the human state, become more than a specific medical device. And the way to think about that may be best by looking at an example of Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist. Back in the late 50s, he put together a challenge that's credited by many as being the onset of the modern era of nanotechnology. His challenge was to build devices and perform tasks at the nanoscale, which eventually people were able to do. what I'd like to do is get back to Newton, who could see things drop, who saw things drop in a way that was different than everybody else who would walk past the apple tree. And today, what I'd like you to think about is using some of the insights from the computer network and security arena that deals with malware, to use the insights that we've gained from cancer, and instead of focusing 100% of our energy on understanding how to control those, start to think about how those systems are able to unlock their own potential and apply that to the savant brain so that we can learn better the potential of the human brain and create one more transformative innovation that can affect the human condition.